forward. Oh, okay, good. Okay, yeah, that works. So I'm going to start with a few caveats about this talk. I'm obviously not the implementer of this IMW. I'm more coming in as a regional partner doing an after-action review because I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this IMW. I know many of you have heard about this IMW for many years. I really am coming in as someone I've been involved for the last 6 years as someone looking in and waiting for results, talking to people. We're a backbone organization as a regional recovery board, so our job is to work with partners, implement the recovery board, provide support. Really, I'm a customer of monitoring, and the IMW was a big piece of monitoring that we were hoping to use the information from. The other thing is that my organization spent an immense amount of time making sure that funders and sponsors and partners were all on board to implement the project restoration side of this. And so that's the other part of this story is how well did we do on the science side, but then how well did we do on the implementation side? Because I know some IMWs struggle on one side or the other. The other caveat is I don't have a lot of time today to go into a lot of details, so I'm going to gloss over a lot of things, but I'm happy to answer questions later. And then also, this is based on a fairly small sample size. I interviewed folks and sent out a survey. I tried to get a pretty representative group of folks that I chatted with and talked to and try to get some information about what was their perspective on the IMW, what went well, what didn't go well, what could we do better, what sort of messages would they have for a group like you. So I talked to scientists that were involved in implementing the IMW. I talked to sponsors that were involved in working with communities and landowners and getting funding and getting work on the ground. I talked to funders who were involved with writing the check and working with the contracts with these groups. And then with stakeholders, and that's pretty broad. I didn't actually talk to landowners. Well, actually I did. I talked to the land trust, who's the landowner in the Entiat, and I also talked to folks that were working with other landowners in the community, and I'll get into that because I think they're a big piece of this story. So the Entiat IMW started back in 2004, and it went up until this year. And it was stopped short of the final phase of restoration, which I'll get into. It was a BPA IMW funded under one of the RPAs. It focused on spring Chinook and steelhead and had a backy design. It was implemented by a consulting firm, Terqua, which I'll also get into. And the staircase design had initially four phases of restoration, but that was narrowed down to 3. And the methods were basically some of what we've already talked about, CHAMP, ISM. But the methods changed at various times, and I'm as an outsider, I'm a little bit unclear on the changes in methodology, but I heard from numerous people that the methods changed at various times. So how well did we do? So I would say on the implementation side, we stuck as well as we could to the staircase design. We did a phase of implementation in 2012, and then in 2014, and then the 2017 got delayed for various reasons, and so part of it went into 2018, and then there's a huge phase of restoration that'll be going in the next few years. There was a control reach within the Entiat, and then the Mad River, which is off to your left, was the other control. Although I'll note that for Chinook, the Mad River is not really much of Chinook habitat. So for Chinook, I would say the Mad River is not necessarily a control, and that sort of played out. So between 2012 and 2014, 13 restoration projects were completed by 4 major sponsors. I'll also note there were numerous acquisitions. One thing that was found early on was that to get that number of willing landowners in place in specific parts of the watershed at specific times is incredibly difficult. So it's one thing to write down on paper that you're going to do a staircase design in certain areas and set it up. It's another thing to actually make that happen. So the land trust came in and the surf board came in and funded those acquisitions. They restored 11 miles, 25 acres, and many log structures. I'll say there were a lot of constraints on restoration in the first 2 phases of implementation, and I'm going to get into that. But I would say this first phase of 2012, 2014, where it was implemented, it was fairly small in scale and scope because of landowner restrictions, geomorphology, various other issues. This next phase is huge. In the next 2 years, it's going to go in over $13 million project, over 5 miles. Some of it's been implemented already by the Yakima Nation. It says 6 projects, but I'm saying projects as in it's a 5 miles of restoration meant to fully restore to the maximum extent we can those 5 miles, and it's through floodplain activation, side channels, and large wood. So the monitoring from the first phase from 2012 to 2014, really they were not similar to the John Day actually. We weren't able to detect a response. The one was in wood, but we placed that wood, so that was expected. We should hope that would happen. There was not a fish response in terms of survival or abundance or any of the fish metrics at the watershed scale. Even at the valley segment, which is somewhat of a large reach, which included the treatments, there was no response in Chinook, actually a decrease in survival after restoration. And they did note a increase in survival of steelhead, but I've been told that hasn't been validated and needs to be validated. So I wish we kind of knew why, and it's good to hear that some of the IMWs have dug into when we do have a negative or a no response, what that may be related to. In this case, we don't exactly know why. I think those of us that were involved in the 2012-2014 restoration, we think we may just not have gone big enough, given where those projects were. It was fairly constrained in terms of what we can do, and the types of treatments we were doing take a while to show a response. So I'm going to get into the survey of folks and sort of looking back over the last 10 or so years. How do people feel about this IMW? I'd say around the whole region, there's immense frustration about this process and about the results from it. I think when you go in and ask people to buy into this project, as in the science and the restoration, that's a lot to ask. You're asking sponsors to come up with an immense amount of money, get a lot of landowners on board, follow a schedule, get the work on the ground, and then and you're asking a lot of the funders, you're asking a lot of the community. It's a lot to ask to get one of these done. And so when it didn't exactly pan out the way that it was promised, I think there's just a lot of frustration. There's a range of opinions about why it failed, and I say failed because I don't think really we know at this point what's going to happen, and the funding was cut before the large project went in, and there's also uncertainty about whether folks believe it should have continued as planned. I will say I know of very little data or information being used. It's hard to access the information. When I even went to do this presentation, I just even Googled Entiat IMW. There's nothing out there. There's a few annual reports, but it's very difficult to access any of the data and information, and I personally don't know of anyone using it. The multiple goals that were going on in the Entiat are not exactly clear, but with CHAMP, ISEMS, and the IMW all within the Entiat, there were a lot of overlapping goals, and I think some of them at times were conflicting, and it really wasn't clear exactly what goals of each program were. And I don't think the goals of that program exactly matched with what folks were looking for in terms of information. And there were some promises made about what information would come out that actually did not come out of it. So rolling that into some lessons learned, this largely comes from what I talked to folks about and what they thought they wish they had done differently. I think in terms of this study design, I think about something that's relevant to partners and funders. Like I said, this is a huge ask of the folks around the table, the implementers, the funders. You have to make it relevant to what they need to continue to do their jobs. I think you need to discuss potential issues early. I think some of this came up today. So the Entiat Spring Chinook hatchery program shut down right in the middle of this. 2010 was the last year of returns. Also, there were 30% hatchery stray spring Chinook coming from an adjacent watershed, and they fixed some of the acclimation, and so there was a huge drop in the number of strays coming in. So we went from a large hatchery influence to a fairly small hatchery influence at this point, and that was a huge confounding factor in all of the results and could have been brought up fairly early. and discussed what we're going to do about that. There was also other issues with the design. So in the Entiat, the restoration started in the lower river and in some other areas that had very little geomorphic potential. And there's reach assessments that had been done that identified restoration opportunities. And looking back, I think we should have started in the areas that had the biggest restoration potential, and then worked towards the small areas. Instead, we started with the the areas with the least potential, and then we didn't even get to the big project that had the most potential. So that was super frustrating. Plus the restoration goals. So these projects are floodplain and in-stream complexity, and the goals for the project are long-term. These wood structures are meant to fundamentally change the river, create habitat. That takes many years. So I think there was a disconnect between the project goals and the timelines that were clearly defined and the IMW goals and what was expected to come out of that. And we really haven't had any big flow events to fundamentally change the habitat as we expect to happen over the next several decades. But the fact that we didn't see a response, it's hard to know exactly what to tie that to. There were also, like I mentioned, many study objectives and many response variables. As you know, looking at the CHAMP data, there's so many response variables and data that was collected. I think focusing at least on a few core metrics and few core objectives would really help. And less can be more. So we had a ton of data at sites, at control sites, I would say. Very little data at any of our treated areas. We had very little continuous data. There was a lot of point data, but almost no continuous data to use when we were planning the project. I think when we reached certain points and we knew there were changes that were happening in terms of funding or project implementation, I think there needed to be a really clear if this happens, then we'll do this. Maybe we should have furloughed and waited to do the monitoring until a few years had gone by. I think the point of going back and showing that a site hadn't changed over and over again when there hadn't been a big flood event and we hadn't done restoration, I just don't see that there was a lot of value, at least from our perspective and other people's perspective of that. The change in methods, so one of the goals in the watershed was to test methodologies. And then there was also a lot of assumptions about fish habitat relationships that would be worked out and would inform the results. But when those didn't exactly pan out, I think it was hard to know exactly what the results would be based on. So I think at least having some established methods with the smolt traps and the pit tag arrays and the snorkel surveys, I think that's really important, and having that basic data that you're getting out and communicating. We also knew very little about the life history and habitat use of the fish in the Entiat, and we're finding out just now how complex the life history and the habitat use of the Entiat fish is, and that complicates a lot of the results. We're also, still trying to grapple with what the limiting factors are, both within the Entiat and within their entire life cycle. And good effectiveness, this is something I realized too. I think having good effectiveness monitoring at the appropriate scale is really a good foundation for these, because you can it helps you explain why or why not you're seeing a response at the watershed scale. I think some folks have talked about, we didn't see a response at this level, but we can explain it because of these factors that happened at a reach or project scale. The other thing that folks brought up is, in the Entiat at least, some IMWs are based on projects that are basically turning habitat on. You're removing a barrier, or you're taking habitat that's completely void of any value and creating value there. In the Entiat, we weren't turning the habitat on, we were adjusting it. I'll never forget this story where the folks who were doing the dewatering or the defishing in one of the logjam projects, they went and defished and found a ton of juvenile fish right in the area where they were going to do the logjam. And that was just so important for me to hear, because I wish that we had the fish data before doing the project, so we would have that as a baseline about how to design that project and where the value in the watershed was to start with. The other lesson learned is really local partnerships. I think this is something that could have really been done better in the Entiat and in the Upper Columbia in general. I think who you choose to implement your IMW or your monitoring program in general is key. I think you can leverage the relationships and the investment that certain agencies or organizations have in an area, and the more you can kind of keep it to someone that really is invested, where you don't have to pay them to go to meetings or pay them to present, or you know, that they're invested, they can carry forward the data and the results past when that IMW ends. That is incredibly useful. I think we were one of the, looking at this list, I think we were one of the few that had a consultant. Most of them are done by state agencies, so that's kind of unique to ours. And I say that was a huge challenge for us. It was very difficult to get the information, and now we really don't have anyone to go to understand what's carried forward. And I'll kind of speed up. Like I said, I don't have a lot of time to get into these very much, but I think partner goals are mutually beneficial, not mutually exclusive. Their goals are also your goals. They're trying to understand whether their projects work and what to do differently. And if they succeed at doing better restoration, you succeed because hopefully there's a better fish response for you to pick up on. I think you have to discuss and agree on the objectives and outcomes. That was really clear that that wasn't quite done as well as it could have. I think discussing issues, as soon as we knew that some of the restoration projects weren't going to be as big as planned, we should have discussed what that meant and figured that out. Be open to flexibility and change, and balance your scientific goals with meaningful outcomes. So a lot of decisions were made based on scientific rigor, but I think at some point it needs to be about, are we really producing something that's meaningful and useful? And I think this one was clear. I think if we're going to do these, we have to be committed for the long term, and that takes an investment of everyone around the table. And the third, this is the last sort of type of lessons learned, but I think we all know implementing IMW level restoration is incredibly difficult and expensive. I think in the Entiat, we actually did have a success story in terms of being able to leverage a ton of money in a very short period of time, because the funders came to the table and the partners came to the table. This is the Enloe site in the middle Entiat, which is implemented next year. So the land trust went and purchased this property, then they moved this house, then we had a sponsor come in and put in an application for the surfboard funding. So this was many, many years to get this project done. Many, many partners, but I would say that the partners and the funders were committed, and they achieved, you know, they were maybe a few years off, but they did implement the scale and scope of restoration, and it's just too bad we don't have monitoring to show what that will result in. I think having a watershed that's a priority area makes a huge difference, because that's the only way you're going to get funding to do the work you need to do, and the projects have to be robust. So considering which projects are planned, how big they are going to be based on the geomorphic potential and the landowner willingness, and you know, other constraints on restoration, like recreation even can be a huge constraint on how big you can go. You can't do anything without willing landowners. This community is really small, and they were asked to do a ton of restoration work, and there was a ton of monitoring. So I've heard this from a lot of people, that this community is totally spent. Like they are done, and the fact that that we don't have anything to show them that all of this is worth it is incredibly frustrating. So be sensitive to that. That you know, there's hundreds of logs being driven up the watershed, and it's a really small community. So I just want you to keep that in mind and be honest with your expectations. I think project management is really important and overlooked. I think not all projects are created equal. Some may not exactly be as big as we hope they are. So you have to kind of look specifically at the project that comes out and be realistic about those outcomes that you're expecting to get. And like I said, look for a system with few constraints, because oftentimes you're very constrained in terms of what you can do. And ultimately, I think what this said to me is, I'm not sure we agree on what success looks like. around the table for not just IMWs, but a lot of monitoring. I think it depends on who you ask, and I think having an agreement with the partners in a specific area about what success means to them right from the start is an incredibly important piece of this process. And you have to, it can't just be about showing that we had a positive response in survival or abundance or whatever the fish metric is. It has to be that we did the right work and that we continue to have support for the work we're doing moving forward, and that people's needs are going to be met. And I think in the Entiat, I'm curious to see where it goes. GFW is talking about maybe stepping in and picking up some of these data. I think we have a great baseline that could be leveraged. There's talk of moving in and using some of the data to parameterize an EDT or a life cycle model. Those are all really useful tools that we could move forward with. So sorry I went over a lot.